Thanks a lot, everyone, for joining today. And our wonderful guest is the founder of a creative agency called Ueno. And Ueno, you probably heard and seen many, many works of this wonderful global design agency that has offices in San Francisco, LA, New York, and Iceland. So you've probably seen the Uber website or Airbnb website. So that's all the secret power of Ueno Design Studio. And also such products as Slack and Superhuman. Again, Ueno help them to build these digital wonderful experiences. So it's my personal pleasure today to introduce Hallie, the founder and creative director. Hello. I am really excited because I feel like there are so many questions that I want to ask, but hopefully we'll have questions from the audience as well. So the first half, I'll ask my own questions, and then we'll start taking questions from the audience. So everyone who's watching us, prepare your questions, and in about half an hour, we'll start asking them. So my first question will be to you about Ueno, and you're very famous for your creative culture, and you've been voted the best place to work by EdAge. So it's really exciting, and I've seen lots of your talks where you talk about how you built it. Can you tell a bit more, why is it so special? What do you feel is your environment and culture that makes it so appealing to lots of people?
So when I started the agency, I was not thinking about culture. I came from a background where I was freelancing for 7 years. So I was home alone pretty much for that whole time. So culture was not something that was at the top of my mind. And when we started, we set up much more like a network of freelancers. So it was, we had 10, 15 people, but it didn't really feel like it was a cohesive company. And then slowly, obviously culture starts to form anyway. So we had some sort of beginning inklings of what a culture could be, and maybe about 2 years into it, we really took a look very closely at who we were and who we wanted to be, and defined core culture values that we've since that we don't get tired of talking about. I think the culture is again, I didn't think this 3-4 years ago, but I think culture is now the most important thing that any company has. It's the only way that the company can really scale, and scale in a way that is where the things that you care about remain inside the company, and it needs to work independent of the people, because people come and go. So it needs to be something that's somehow in the air and in the water, and something that people feel when they walk in, and hopefully something that can live for a very long time.
Sounds great. And can you give any examples of how do you help to constitute that culture? Because I've seen your values, they all make sense, and I think I would love to work in a company that has those values. And I think every company wants to create something that will be special. But what does it look day to day? Do you have any special meetings? Do you, I don't know, bring your pets to work? What is it day to day?
There is, obviously a lot of normal office things that happen here, and where you don't necessarily always feel the culture, but there is, we put a lot of effort into how we design our offices, so they should feel the way the culture should feel. We put a lot of effort into how we hire people. So how do we bring them in? We have multiple regular things, like we have a monthly all hands where a weekly all hands where the whole company joins. We have office specific events. We have a retreat every year where the whole company comes together. and multiple things that we try and do to sort of make sure that people feel connected and are part of a community. But day to day, it's most of the things are office things, people going to meetings and people having arguments.
That sounds good. And how do you make sure if something happens that is definitely off your culture? I don't know, like there must be things that you can predict. How do you go about that?
So like I mentioned before, I think the most important part culturally is how we hire people. So there is a fairly I don't want to say long, but it's a little long hiring process where we make sure that the people that we're hiring are gonna add something to our culture and gonna bring something new and exciting to who we are. But if things go wrong and people are people and people have moments, we try and address it. So one of our culture values is to be raw, and so we try and go straight to the source and just tell them that this was not cool and let's try and fix it.
Good. So it's all about radical candor and telling things as they are, and yeah, it makes sense. And in terms of your hiring process, again, one of your websites was all about that, the one words, and it sounds like fun to be hired and to go through the process. My personal experience with hiring designers and in general hiring people, especially actually non-designers, is that it's almost impossible to figure out who a person is from these half-an-hour conversations or whatever. No matter how many you have, people come prepared, they say the right things, and sometimes you can get kind of the wrong opinion about a person before that. So do you have any tips or tricks, like any questions you ask, or how do you judge a person from these very short conversations?
I think you're absolutely right. There's some people that interview really well and some people that don't, and it doesn't mean that the person that interviews great is the right person, or the person that doesn't interview great is the wrong person. So it's a lot of little things, but we have different types of interviews. So people come in into interviews with different agendas and try and get at different sides of a personality or the work that the people are doing. So if it's a designer, there's portfolio interviews, but there's also culture interviews. We also have done a couple of other things. So when we have someone that's getting close to being hired, we usually try and invite them into a social setting. So people drop their guard and we hopefully want to see their personality.
To get them drunk essentially and see what will happen.
Sometimes that helps a little bit. But we've also done a lot of bringing people in on a contract. So instead of just going through the normal interview process, we'll try and offer them to work with us for 2 to 6 weeks, and during that time, it starts to be very clear who's right and who's not. My personal thing for interviews is I try and ask weird questions and try and push people into a zone where they will say something or get them out of the routine that they're in, and hopefully knock them into something, knock them into their real personality.
Can you give an example of one of the weird questions that you asked?
If I did, then I couldn't ask them.
Oh, well, I'll try to imagine, but I think it's a good tip, definitely going for non-interview questions to get the real raw answers from people.
Yeah, and I think it's, without going too far, I think it's good to have people sometimes in interviews slightly uncomfortable because they will be uncomfortable in their job and you want to see how they handle it.
Great. Brilliant advice. Let's talk about your agency for a bit, because you had a wonderful journey. You're a relatively young agency. You're 5 years old, even less, and you already done so much incredible work for some of the biggest and most well-known brands. What was this journey like? Maybe what was the highlight and the lowlight of this 5-year experience for you?
So like I said in the beginning, I started as a freelancer, so that was what I was intending to build, was basically a network of freelancers. Um, and but I sort of started to realize that what I really wanted was a group of people that worked closer together and became bigger than any one individual. And my highlights are when we bring in people and I see them blossom. Usually people come in and they have a bit of an awkward starting phase, and they have, they're coming into something new, and then when you see them take off, that's really rewarding. The low points are kind of the flip side of that, is sometimes things don't work out with people for various reasons. It might not be the right time for the company or right time in their career or whatever it is, and it's very, very hard to either let someone go or have someone leave. Those are usually the hardest moments.
How do you go about firing people?
Luckily, we haven't fired a lot of people, but we do, we do try our best, and we go to lengths to try and make them or get them back on track. So we do try and give people multiple chances. Sometimes I think too many, but there is a sort of step-by-step process, and if people continue not to improve during that process, then at the end of it, you have to decide, okay, it's not going to work out this time.
Makes sense. Sad, but makes sense. I love that your company has lots of interesting kind of pockets and branches of things that you do, including Ueno Design, Ueno Shop, and Bueno, and all these wonderful things. How do you run all of them, and why did you decide to have all of them as well?
Usually they come out of something internally that we're doing or thinking about. We started Ueno Design because we were posting a lot of things internally, as I think probably most design agencies do, where they're posting on their Slack or something, inspiration, things that we find. So we wanted, we thought there's a lot of good content here. Why don't we get it out into the world? With Bueno, we were doing pretty much since day one. We've been financially successful, so it's been helpful. We've tried to give some of that back, and about a year or two in, we formalized that into a thing we called Bueno, and we've recently announced that we're doing at least $1 million over the next 10 years in donations.
That's amazing.
So there's a lot of different ways that these things come up. With the store, we're working on with a lot of clients, obviously, that have e-commerce or even physical stores, and we wanted to try it out ourselves, just to sort of experiment with what it would be like, what can we learn internally, so that we can be better at doing it for our clients.
I think with the Ueno store, it's quite an interesting one because you sell other people's stuff as well. So it's like a curated feed of things you would buy. So what's the end goal of that? Clearly, you won't make millions by that. Like, what's the logic?
The first part of the store was, it's basically just a curated place where we find nice things, and we showcase them, and people can buy them if they want to. And it's not a money-making thing. I don't know what we made of it, but it's not a lot of money. But that was not the intent. It was more, again, to sort of figure out at a very in a very easy way what it would be like to run your own things, because I think it's very important to be able to empathize with your clients, and they have, you know, they're doing these things. We need to be able to put ourselves in their shoes. But the next phase of the store is we've been working on a lot of our own objects and things, so we're going to start putting them out there. Again, the objective there is not to make money, but more to just try out what does it take to create your own things. What are the, you know, when you're on the outside and looking in, you don't realize how much work it is. But once you've done it, you really appreciate all the things that go into this when you're working with a client.
We're in a similar phase right now where we're thinking whether it's worth producing our own things. Would people buy? Do people need our things, and especially branded things? If anyone watching us right now, tell us, would you buy a hoodie of Futureland Academy? Or, I don't know, do you want to give an example of Ueno's thing that you might be selling to give some votes from people, whether they would buy it or not?
We have some fairly, you know, there's some things that are very easy to make, like you know, t-shirts and socks and hoodies or whatever it is. But we're also trying to make some things that are a little bit unique. So we're making, one of our values is to bring the chocolate. So we're making chocolate.
Yeah, I've seen those. They're so cute.
They're adorable. And then we have a book that has, we've worked with a lot of different artists, and we've with them created a lot of great art. So we have a book that's coming out. We're working on physical objects. The first two are a stool and a light. So things that are the people would hopefully have in their homes and can use for a long time.
That's quite a big stretch from a chocolate to a lamp and a stool. Like, how was it, like, obvious? Okay, the next thing is definitely a stool. Or were you like, okay, 50 things that we might produce, stool would make sense?
I don't know if any of this makes any sense. The stool and the light came about for, you know, we wanted to make physical things, and there were a couple of people that we wanted to work with, and they just happened to make stools and lights, and so yeah, it was a little bit of just the opportunity was there, and we thought let's try and do that.
Amazing. In terms of your design process, I actually mentioned the illustrations were cute. I wanted to introduce you as one of the cutest agencies that I don't know, when I look at your work, it's always so warm and kind of, it has a lot of illustration, and it just feels very personal. And I want to talk a bit more about that, because you have a lot of illustration, you also work on branding, and you work on digital, and you build things. So it's kind of quite a lot for one agency to do. How do you combine all of that? And also when you're working on let's say Slack as an example, how do you come up with the initial things? What's the first thing you think about to create this brand structure, or how does the process work?
That's a very big question. I think branding is a very complicated word and a very complicated concept. So a lot of people think about it as a logo, and obviously it's a part of it. Some people then start to expand that and think about it in terms of colors and you know, typography, and that's also a part of it. But it's really about a feeling, and it's very hard to quantify what makes someone feel something. But our job is really to help our customers create some kind of relationship with their clients. So if you're using a product or interfacing with a brand that we've worked on, we're trying to make you feel something, something that we've identified as being important to that company, and we're trying to make you form a connection or a relationship with that company. And it's just like when you think about relationship with people, it's a lot of different things. When you think about, you know, your best friend or someone, it's that they're there for you for the long term. They're not trying to swindle you. They're not, you know, sometimes, you know, they need something from you, but they give something to you, and it's a mutual thing. And that's what we want to try and build through our brands. So it's you could call it manipulative, but it's hopefully honest, and it's something that's true to the company that we're working with, and it's something that feels right. It achieves their business goals. It sort of elevates them in the mind of the user. It does all these things that can be somewhat hard to measure, but without them, you know, these companies would definitely fail.
But how do you go about it? Because feeling is something, first of all, can be different from different people. So you say yellow feels bright and positive, and for some people it might be annoying and, I don't know, distracting. So how do you, when you build a brand that will be seen by lots of people, where do you start? Or do you map the feelings of the brand and then try to match, I don't know, colors and illustration style? Where does this journey start?
It definitely starts with a solid strategy for that company. So what is that company trying to achieve, and what kind of relationships do they want to build with their customers? And from there, it's part of it is definitely the visual, like it's what you mentioned, it's the colors, but I think the illustrations and whatever. But it's also, and maybe even bigger, it's, you know, how do you speak, and when you think about a product, what is the thing that you're solving for someone? And so yes, absolutely, people do have different feelings about specific things, but hopefully as a whole they have, you know, when they think about that company, they think about the things that we are trying to make them think about. They think about a company because it solves some of their problems, or it gives them joy in some way, or it does something for them. How we do it, that's a very long question, a very long answer.
Okay, I think we'll have a separate conversation some other time where we'll go through the process, because I think it's fascinating, because a lot of brands right now, you're right, they're trying to figure out what does it mean to be a digital brand, especially if the product only exists in digital and that's their only touch point. So what is the animation should be like, what is the sound might be like, yeah, copywriting, everything becomes this part of the brand. And I think a lot of designers now struggle with translating the brand from lovely guidebooks and colors and whatever else into the interface and into the interaction and into the experience. And these are the things that you're right said about the feelings, but how do you create them?
I think one of the most challenging things to do is when you have a product, and a digital product that's primarily on a phone. It's a very small screen, and it's something that you know, people are used to, and they need, you know, almost pure function. But how do you make it also have some feeling, so it's not just this nothing brand, so it doesn't feel, you know, if it's just something that solves your problems, it's not, somebody else can probably solve that problem better at a later stage, and it's not going to be a sticky relationship. So I think the thing that's the most important for us is we think about these things holistically. So there's a lot of you know, great branding agencies, people that do great branding but are not natively digital. So the branding that they do will give you, you know, the things we talked about in the beginning. It's the logo and the colors and maybe an illustration style, or maybe even a tone of voice, but they don't have, there's no digital touch point. So then they hand that over to an internal team or to another agency, and those people have no idea what to do with it, because it's it that part of it, but the most important part of it hasn't been thought through. So what we are trying to do is doing this the other way around. So it's more like digital first branding. So you think about a product, you extract the things from there, and that becomes your brand. So it doesn't feel forced from the outside in. It's from the inside out.
That's a good advice. And did you have to then go back to a brand team and say, so for example, Uber, I think they rebranded first and then they came to you for the website. I assume that was the logical step. So did you come back to them and say, okay, when we started building, we realized this was your original brand was missing. These are our suggestions.
So when we worked with Uber, they had already started working on the rebrand, but they hadn't done the whole thing. So we were able to work very closely with them through that process of, going back and forth. And that's sort of one of the best ways to do it is trying things out on a big scale and then taking them into the product or some of the marketing, and then vice versa, and going back and forth until you have something that feels cohesive and works together. If one team just goes off on its own and does this whole thing and then hands it over to all the other teams, then it's probably not going to work.
So working closely with the traditional branding team, exchanging, collaborating, that's the key.
Yeah, absolutely. And we, I think one of the, like I mentioned before, one of the toughest jobs we get is when there's been a branding project done and we get the output of that branding project, and it's maybe even beautiful work, but it's maybe just billboards and T-shirts, and that's nice, but the main touch point, the way that people will experience most of these brands is through their digital product. So let's make sure that it works there first.
And do you start, is there one kind of, I know the process is very long, but is there one starting point? For example, you start with overall journey. So you make sure that if the value is friendly, then the journey is kind of friendly and fun and flexible. Or do you start with, let's design a button, and from the button we can grow to kind of bigger interface?
The way I personally work is I try and work on as many of these things together as possible, going from one to another until they all mix. Mm-hmm. And not trying to perfect one thing, but trying to jump between one to the other and having each of these things influence each other. So at the end you have something that's fully fleshed out and works on, in many different ways. So no, I would not personally recommend just really polishing one thing and having that be like the only thing that is working, and then trying to force it on everything else. That's probably not going to work.
And the last question about branding: how do you, at the end, kind of test or understand if you did a good job when you were working on these things, and you feel like you're switching between things? How do you assess? Okay, is it like, I don't know, you show one screen to a person and can you recognize a brand, or what's your test for this?
Branding is very, very hard to test for. When we work on products, that's usually fairly easy to test. You can check what works and what not, and what doesn't, and it's something that you can run through metrics. You can definitely do some testing on branding, and we do some of that, but ultimately, I think a brand needs to be it needs to have a vision, and it's very hard to test for a vision. It needs to be something that someone internally really, really believes in and sort of honestly feels in their gut is the right way to go, and moves forward with that.
So only time can tell if kind of it
Well,
all
there's
was part of.
definitely there is testing, but less and less. For products, I more and more believe in testing. Less and less do I believe in it for branding.
Okay,
I think
great.
it needs to be um, honest, and it needs to be true. And it's if you start to test your personality, for example, it's not going to be authentic. Even
Got
if
it.
you can maximize yourself in certain situations, it's not going to be the true uh, version of yourself.
That's a really good answer. Um, let's talk about the kind of the overall visual style and design that you do, because I don't want to use the word trendy, but you're ahead of the trend and you set some of the trends, and your work always looks fresh, and kind of current, so people really enjoy your products. How do you, I suppose, educate yourself, or how do you get inspired? Where do you look? Do you read blogs? Do you read books? Do you go to museums? Where do you get these ideas and inspiration from?
Me personally, I don't. Um, I used to go to a lot of when I was learning design. I would definitely, pay very close attention to what was happening, and I think that's a great way to learn. But as you get more experience, I think it's important to break out of what everyone else is doing. I do pay attention to what's happening on sites like Dribble and other places, but most of the time, once it hits saturation, you don't want to do that. You don't want to be following. If you can look at your design and find 30 similar things on a site like Dribble, you're probably on the wrong path. um, so when I think about design, I want to think about how does this look like in 10 years? What is it, or 15 or 20 years? How does it not become obsolete so fast that in 6 months it's going to look old? I mean, at some point, especially with digital design, it's always going to look old. But how do you make sure that it stays relevant for a little bit longer? And usually that's by somewhat ignoring what everyone else is doing and trying to find your own way, but also looking into the past and seeing there are certain things in design that have lasted for decades, and there's reasons for that. Some things from the mid 19th century still feel fresh, and so there's a lot of clues to be taken from history of how do you make things that don't grow old as fast.
So do you read history books, or you just rely on your own intuition?
I do. I do try and read a lot. I do try and explore different parts of the world, and I think through travel and then I think touching different mediums is important. So again, going back to the light or the stool, trying your hand at designing something else, and how do some of those skills translate to something else, and how do the new skills you learn translate into what you're doing?
I think that's a brilliant advice. I think this needs to be like in big letters and quoted. Don't look at the trends, look at the past and create classics, and try something new and learn how you can apply that in your work. That's brilliant.
Yeah, I think for young, I mean, I definitely see why, and I think it's understandable that your younger designers don't have that perspective, and it's perfectly normal, and that's what I personally did, to just copy what everyone else is doing for a while. But hopefully the more experienced people on your team will help guide you into other new things.
We will be taking questions from the audience in a second, so start posting your questions and comments, and I can see lots of People saying lots of nice things about you and Ueno. So you have lots of fans who love your work and everything that you do. So it's really good that they are able to join us today. So please write your questions and comments, and we'll try to answer as many of them as possible. While people are thinking about their best questions, I have another very important one to you, which is about diversity and inclusion. And you tweet a lot about inclusion and about how conferences are not always inclusive, and events in general, and just inclusive design. Tell me more about, tell to the people that maybe haven't thought of this. Why is it important and why we should all care?
I think there's multiple ways to answer that question. I think there's definitely a pragmatic answer, but before we get to that, I think it's just simply the right thing to do. If you think about, people are born into their situations. There's nothing better or worse about a person that's born in a particular country versus another country, or a person that's born with a different skin tone or a different gender. Everyone deserves the same opportunity. So that's sort of, I think, at the core. But also, if you think about just the pragmatic side of it, there's a lot to be had, and you can do much better work when you have a diverse team, because a diverse team will create things that work for more people. If everyone on your team looks like you and has the same background as you, you're going to create something that solves the problems for those people. And then, unless that's the objective, that's not a very good way to build something. And we've seen a lot of that in Silicon Valley, for example, where there's a relatively homogeneous group of people that are building things, and they've often forgot about a huge part of the population because nobody on their team had that background, and it has caused them massive problems. And they could have avoided that by thinking about this from the start, by having more diverse teams and having a culture that's inclusive, that celebrates, and rewards different ideas and different perspectives. So I think there's, like I said, there's two sides to that coin. There's, because it's the right thing to do, but it's also it actually works better.
What advice would you give to someone who really want to create more inclusive culture, and maybe they've been already trying to hire for diversity but not succeeding very well, or maybe they do have a diverse team, but as you know, with any diversity, it actually becomes more difficult to run a company that has all sorts of people. So let's talk about inclusivity. What advice would you give people who want to create a more inclusive environment?
Well, maybe to preface this, I don't think we are perfect in any way. I think we have a lot of holes and a lot of flaws both in our diversity and inclusion work, and I think there's a long way to go for us internally. So I don't want to say that we're some kind of a shining beacon, but I think there are. You see it in the bigger companies. It's very hard to retroactively do something like this. It's once you have a company of a few hundred or even a few thousand or tens of thousands of people, it's very hard to change the culture, and it's very hard to do something that has real change. So you can see, the bigger companies are moving the needle very slowly. They're and somewhat understandably, because it's just a very, very tough thing to do. So the first thing, and this is terrible advice for anyone that's already started, but I think the best advice is to build it into the company culture from day one, and think about this from day one, because as more time passes, it becomes a harder and harder thing to fix. It becomes something that definitely not impossible, but it's just it gets very hard. So I think that's the biggest advice that I can give, is because that's what we try to do, is try and do this from the start. But yeah, I don't know. There's, there's a lot of other things, and there's a lot of other people that are better to answer that question.
I think it's a good answer, especially because I think more people and more companies just need to start thinking about it. I think there is not enough truly thinking, not just having the headline of having a diversity as part of the values, but actually truly thinking each person in the company, what does it mean, how that can happen, and what they can do. So definitely, if more people start talking, discussing, debating, and arguing about it, I think that is already a good start.
I think you can also, yes, I mean, obviously, discussing is a good first point, but ultimately the first real step is acknowledging that there's a problem and getting people on board with that this is something that we need to fix and something that we want to fix. And one thing I do a lot is anytime I come into a meeting, I think about just, for a split second, okay, how many, let's say there's 10 people in the room, I just do a quick mental check on, what's the gender mix, what's the racial background, what's the, what are these things that, all these people, all these meetings add up, and you sort of start to see a trend, or you don't. You start to see, well, actually, I'm just joining meetings where there's 80% men, 80% white men. That's a problem. Or I'm joining meetings where there's maybe a good gender mix, and I'm like, okay, this starts to feel a little bit better. And you start to think about the relationships you have with people. Are they do they all look like me? That's probably a problem. Or can I, and then once I realize that, can I do something about it? Are there people on my team that I can try and bring into this that I've neglected for some reason? Do I have, like everyone, do I have mental bias towards or against the group? And checking yourself and checking your thoughts.
I think that's a great tip. Definitely having a mental check every time you're making important decisions and having meeting. Are you actually including different opinions and not just everyone who echoes your point of view? Well, I think, guys, if you have more questions, please write them now, because we have the last 10 minutes. But I have a couple of questions that I really want to ask, so I'm really glad that I have more time. I want to talk about kind of your life, because you had a very interesting and not probably the easiest life, and you had to overcome lots of obstacles. Do you have any advice, or maybe your personal tip as well, when you get to the very dark kind of place and low point in your life, whether it has objective reasons for that, or sometimes not even objective? I think creative people sometimes get to these places for not really much reason. How do you get yourself out of this, and what again, first step or something that someone can do to get out of there?
So I'm a big advocate for medication. I think a lot of people are afraid to, a lot of people that have depression, so I have depression, a lot of people that have it are afraid to use medication because they're, worried for, that they will change their personality or, do certain things. And while I think that some of those are fair, I think I can say for myself, without the medication, I'm not sure that I'll be here today. And so it's been a huge change in my life. I've been on medication for almost 10 years, and it was a massive change for me. So that's the first thing. But there's also um, you know, talking openly about how you're feeling really helps. Um, maybe starting with the people you trust, but the bigger the group, I think for me at least, the better it gets, because afterwards you'll be approached by dozens of people that all have the same situations or very similar situations. You start to see that you're not alone, and this is a perfectly normal way to be. But when I do get down, that does happen. It's sometimes because of an event, obviously, like you mentioned, that something happened that caused it, and sometimes I don't know. Sometimes there's just something messed up in my brain, and it's just I'm not getting the right chemicals. And all the cliche things. Sleeping well helps. Eating the right things at the right time help. Doing all that really helps. Sometimes I have days where I don't want to deal with it, and then I'll go watch some TV or something, and because I know that I've gone through it enough times that I know it's going to get better. I just need to give it a little bit of time.
That's great. I love how you talk about being open about and sharing your experiences. I think a lot of people keep it in themselves, trying to fight it on their own, and I think that's the toughest part. And you're right, just giving yourself sometimes just a kind of time to do nothing and not worry about things and not think about big picture, big plan, and list of things that need to be done. I think we are definitely, definitely myself, I'm always trying to kind of check many things out of my list and sometimes get too deep into work and forget that life actually exists outside.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that it's okay to feel, bad sometimes. We don't always have to be our, best selves. It's as long as you don't go too far down, then maybe don't worry too much about it. It's probably a phase, and you're gonna go through it.
Brilliant. I have a couple of last questions before we finish our talk today, and they're about the future and your future and design future in general. Do you know, or do you have an idea, what will you be doing when you're like 80?
No, I never think that long. I'm very fatalistic. I've assumed that that I have less than 10 years to live for the last 20 years. So I haven't. I never get to 80. And maybe when I'm 75, I can answer that question.
Okay. But in general, I think designers, and especially in digital, because it's relatively, again, new type of career and career path, you don't see like a 70-year-old digital designer, or not that many. And I think a lot of designers always question, like, what will happen when we are 60 or 50 or whatever the scary number, it's different for different people. And do people retire? Do they keep doing? Have you ever thought of like, what your career path? Do you have like, I want to work hard until, I don't know, I achieve something, earn money, whatever, and then I'll do nothing? Or you just want to keep doing what you're doing forever?
My current mindset, and things change, so I don't know if this works forever, but I really like making things, and I really like making things that I've never made before. So I do want to continue to explore different avenues of creativity. I think there's so much that I don't know, and so many things that I would love to do and learn. So I want to keep doing that. I want to keep also getting better at what I do. Part of that is design, but I'm also, I do run a company, so that's the first time for me. So that's a huge new thing that I'm trying to learn, is how to be an actual CEO. And uh, I've never done that, and um, it's terrifying, and but also exciting, and it's a lot of wins and a lot of little losses, and it's yeah, it's sort of like life. It's fascinating.
Well, you're doing
But
great
for
as a CEO, so
depends on who you ask. There is, but I think digital design is very interesting, and that's actually, I think, something that is a very good question, is how will that look in 30 or 40 years? I don't think anyone can answer that, but the only answer is it's going to look very different to what it looks like today. So I think the most important skills that we need to keep teaching designers and our kids and everyone is how to adapt to change, and uh, how to learn new things, how to be uncomfortable, because the only thing that seems to be constant is that it's change, and it's um, change is getting more rapid, with every decade. So whatever we do now is not the way we're going to do it in 10 years, for sure. Most of the hard skills we have right now are not going to work in 10 years. So we need to be able to learn and grow really, really fast.
that is a good point, especially considering our slogan is never stop learning. And, and it's
Perfect.
definitely the mantra that we believe in. The world is changing, so I don't think you can be safe no matter how brilliant you are at current job and field. So always being curious and learning and trying new things, whether building a lamp or a stool. But yeah, being curious, doing new things, and enjoying the process of learning new things, I think, is the key. Do you
Yeah,
have
exactly.
the last advice for someone who's watching us and is maybe also a freelancer like you were before starting Ueno, and thinking, shall I start my own studio? I'm not sure, am I enjoying it? Maybe it's the right point. What could you tell yourself 5 years ago that would definitely help you to build a better company, or maybe faster build a company that you have now?
Um, I think a lot of designers that I meet um, are not interested in business. Um, and if you do think that way, there's no way you can succeed in starting your own company. Uh, you may be able to have a couple of employees or a few employees, but at some point you're going to have to think about this as a business. And if you're not ready for that, then that's not the right thing for you to do.
Good advice. Business, learn design, stay positive and curious. Thanks a lot, Hallie. It was such a pleasure spending this hour with you, and I hope everyone who joined us learned as much as I did during this conversation. You're definitely, so I really appreciate that you shared your thoughts. And if you're not following Ueno Agency, please follow it now. It's awesome, one of the best. Great work everywhere on Dribble, on Instagram. And if you're not following Futureland Academy, do it as well. We're cool. And we'll have more conversations with inspiring people like Hallie. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.